Well, thank you so much, Suzanne, for that lovely invitation and it's a lovely introduction. And thank you also for the invitation to this lovely city. I'm really honored to be here and talking to you today. Sorry. Okay, so the title of my talk today is What Makes a Good Social Science Theory and Why Evolutionary Theory is One. And this is based on a paper co-authored with Joseph Whitmire, who is at the National Science Foundation. And in this talk, I'm going to address 4 questions. First of all, what is social science? Secondly, what is scientific theory and what makes a good scientific theory? And thirdly, what makes a good social science theory and why evolutionary theory is one? And why do we need to supplement the evolutionary model of the actor that's produced by evolutionary theory with other types of explanations? Okay, so what is social science? Well, first of all, the rules of social science are simply the rules of science. And if the rules of science don't hold for some scholarly field concerning social phenomena, then we are dealing with something else. Okay, it's not social science, it's social philosophy, social policy, social activism. These are all valid endeavors, but they are not social science. So what is science? Well, science is based on the scientific method that we all know. It comes from Aristotle and Plato. Everything comes from the Greeks. Aristotle, induction, Plato, deduction, that's it. And together, these create a body of theory, which is a falsifiable body of knowledge that helps us to explain and predict the real world. And so any scientific theory pertains to the real world and has to produce predictions that can be tested with data from the real world. And scientific theory consists of a set of statements. There are descriptions, labels, and definitions. And I'm going to argue today that scientific theory has to have some of those statements as mathematical statements or deductive statements. And this is because it is in the making of mathematical statements that absolute truth holds. So if at least a few of a body of statements cannot be derived mathematically, then it cannot be theory. So here's an example of a scientific explanation from biology. And let's just first of all consider the statement, flamingos are pink because they eat shrimp, okay? This is a step towards a scientific explanation from the purely descriptive statement that flamingos are pink. But if it's not connected to mathematical derivation and thus to theory, it's not yet incorporated fully into science. So here we incorporate this statement into science with this simple mathematical deduction as follows. When flamingos ingest the carotenoid astaxanthin, their feathers are pink. Shrimp contain astaxanthin. If statement number 1 and statement number 2 are correct, then statement number 3 follows. That is that when flamingos ingest shrimp, their feathers are pink. And this is now a scientific explanation. And we do know that they're going to a lower level of analysis, that we do know explanations, we do have explanations for how the astaxanthin gets put into the bloodstream and then gets put into the feathers. We also know the biochemical affinities of astaxanthin with chemicals in the blood, chemicals in the feather. And so at a lower level of analysis, we know all of that. And together, this creates a scientific explanation of why flamingos are pink. And that's how we get the statement, which is a scientific explanation. Flamingos are pink because they eat shrimp. So rarely, we don't always have to go to the biochemical level, but it is there. And that is true of all scientific theory, that, as I will go on to note, that it is always, any theory at any level of analysis is always compatible with theories at lower levels of analysis. Now, the social sciences are somewhat like biology. In biology, you have a profusion of species. In social sciences, you have a profusion of cultures. And this means that a great deal of descriptive and observational activity and work is necessary. Yet, once again, we argue, that if these are not embedded in a body of mathematical or mathematizable derivations with all the accompanying labels and definitions and so forth, then there's no theory. And if there's no theory, there's no science. So what about machine learning techniques? You hear a lot about these days. And you can consider these induction from observation on steroids, and massive amounts of data that get used in this machine learning techniques. And really what these provide is descriptions for theory to then explain. Now, these descriptions may be very useful for inductive prediction, especially if we're predicting things in the same context in which the data were originally generated. But since there is no mathematical derivation or deductions, these techniques do not give us truth the way mathematics does. And you also see many people use simulations. Well, does this produce social science theory? Now, as you know, a simulation consists of a process. It's in an algorithm. You have a starting point. You have certain parameters. You have inputs with different levels. And then you run the simulation and you get outputs. And you can do this, simulate a variety of social processes. For example, you can simulate encounters between individuals and the spread of disease, and you can have some model of how people encounter each other and how people, whether people are likely to get sick or not. And then you can run the simulations and find out what happens. And then you get these outcomes from the simulation and you compare them with measured empirical outcomes from the real world. And if the simulation outcomes don't match what you see in the real world, then you have to adjust your model and adjust your parameters. And then eventually you get a model and a set of parameters that fits the data pretty well. And then you can go on and make additional predictions using that model. And if, then you go and take those predictions and you get some more data, and they support the predictions from the simulation, then that is support for the theory that's embodied in the model that's in the algorithm in the simulation. And since an algorithm is a mathematical model of a process, then you are proceeding truthfully from assumptions to outcomes. So this seems like it's science, and especially if the embodied mathematical model is compatible with more fine-grained models at lower levels of analysis. So, for example, a good model of the actor, then we do have scientific theory. In other words, the theoretical generation of predictions is built into the simulation. In a sense, it is the simulation, is the theory. The problem is you can only run the simulation for certain starting points and certain parameters, and you can't run the simulation for an infinite number of starting points and an infinite number of parameters. And so you don't know if your predictions are going to hold in every instance. And so simulations inevitably leave gaps. The exception is when you can do a single run of a simulation to prove that something is possible definitively. So for example, you could show using a simulation that just one infected person is enough to spread disease and cause an epidemic in an entire population. You could show that with simulation. So what is a good scientific theory? Well, as I've suggested, scientific theory has a very pragmatic structure. You have theories at different levels of analysis, ranging from the most macro, which is the universe, to the most micro, which is, the quark or something even smaller. I think they have gotten even smaller than the quark. And at every level of analysis, you have bodies of observations, you have definitions and mathematical derivations and deductions or theories at different levels and corresponding to scale. And many observers have noted this, and Feynman noted it in the character of physical law. But always you have this nested quality of good scientific theory that is more macro theories based on more micro theories, or you think of micro theories are nested within the more macro theories. And there's also the well-known quality of emergence is that at aggregate levels, it's not always possible to predict the qualities or the characteristics of the aggregate because of this phenomena of emergence. So phenomena at higher levels of analysis are often qualitatively different to phenomena at lower levels. And once again, we call this emergence. And a very simple example is the fact if we have a collection of H2O molecules, we say that has the characteristic of being wet, but that is an emergent quality. A single H2O molecule cannot be wet. So emergence exists at all different levels of analysis, as I said, from the more micro to the macro. So what is good social science theory? Well, it's just simply scientific theory for social phenomena, nothing special, nothing different. And economic theorists do practice theory development most faithfully. I'm not saying they always do it correctly or they're always right, but they do follow the practice of creating theory using mathematics very faithfully. Theory is always mathematized, and then they are able to produce cumulative results. And so in the social sciences, what do we want to explain? Going back to Max Weber's classification of 3 kinds of exponanda in social science is always very helpful, and their population tendencies, historical events, and ideal types. I also forgot to sort of sum up what I've said so far, which is at the top of this slide, which is that good social scientific theory contains nested theories from micro to macro, and parts of those theories must be deductive or mathematizable, and theory at high levels of analysis must be consistent with theory at lower levels. And as I said, this approach can be used to explain any social phenomena. But once again, I do want to talk about Max Weber's 3 types of exponanda. And the first is population tendencies. And this is what we typically see in just trends in populations. And usually we find those trends from statistical analyses of one sort or another. And, this is just an example of a population tendency that countries with higher GDPs, gross domestic products, tend to have lower fertility rates than countries with lower GDPs. They tend to have higher fertility rates. And that's just one of many, many, many population tendencies that we know about and that statistics have described. Now, the second of Weber's exponents is our historical events, and these are important to explain in social science because historical events often have disproportionate impact on the world. And historical events are one-offs. So there may be one or two of them, but usually there's not very many, certainly not enough for statistical analysis. So a historical event might be a political revolution, or the Industrial Revolution was a one-off event. And with these rare events, it's not possible to do any kind of statistical analysis. Natural experiments are often unlikely. Now, sometimes we can simulate such processes, or we can use a method such as John Stuart Mill's method of difference. But regardless, these historical events, because of their outsized impact on human affairs, they're very important to explain. And the third, Weber's third kind of exponander, ideal types, is in fact the typical focus of building theory. And that is, scientific theory consists of deductively connected or nested models of processes. And these processes and the entities involved almost always are ideal types. And ideal types, they may not actually exist in real life. In real life, things vary a lot, but still the concept of an ideal type is very useful in incredibly necessary in theory building. And in theory building, ideal types can be both explanandum or exponans. So what we're explaining or what we're using to explain the outcome. And we can have mathematizable descriptions of these processes precisely because they involve ideal types. And as I said, real life examples may be somewhat different. And just an example from science is we have one model of stars burning, but each and every star burns a little differently. So our sun may burn differently because our sun has sunspots and some other star doesn't. But still, we have one model of stellar fuel burning to create a star's radiation. And in social science, an ideal type may be an industrial society. Every industrial society is different in some ways. The US, for instance, is different to Austria, but they have enough in common that the concept of an industrial society makes sense, and we can use that concept in our theories. And there are certain characteristics that all industrial societies share, such as a small percentage of the population working in agriculture and things like this. Okay, so why is evolutionary theory a good theory for social science? And I have thought it was, and Suzanne and Martin have used it for the past 25 years very fruitfully. And it is a good theory for social science, and it is for the following reasons. First, it produces a model of the individual human actor, and all social processes involve human actors. We can consider that this model of the actor is a Weberian ideal type. Obviously, there's a lot of variability from person to person, but people have enough in common that we can use a single model of the evolved actor. And this model can then be used to predict and explain population tendencies at aggregate levels. So why is this a good model of the actor? Well, it's consistent with the science at a lower level, which is evolutionary biology and the evolutionary biology of human individuals, and they're the basis, of course, of all social phenomena. And this has a mathematical basis, mathematics of a Mendelian population. You have sexual reproduction. This results in mixing up of the genotypes from generation to generation. Though no change in the original gene pool, and these genotypes give rise to phenotypes. You get change in genotypes through the evolutionary process, and this happens through changes in the frequencies of the original genes. And these are the mutation, meiotic drive, genetic drift, genetic flow, and selection. And selection is generally considered the most important driver of evolution. And as you know, selection occurs when one gene or set of genes produces a phenotype that helps an individual survive and reproduce in a particular environment. And over generations, if the environment doesn't change and those genes or genotypes continually provide the individual with some sort of advantage in terms of survival and reproduction, then eventually over the generations, those genes or genotypes will start to outnumber other genes or genotypes or combinations of genes in the population. And of course, there's two different processes under the umbrella of selection: natural selection, which just refers to the selection of traits that help individuals survive and reproduce in a particular environment. And then you have sexual selection, which refers to the selection of traits that help an individual obtain a mate in a particular environment. And then sexual selection can be divided into intersexual selection, where one sex competes for access to the other sex, such as elephant seals, or intersexual selection, where one sex competes to be chosen by members of the other sex, for example, male bowerbirds. And generally, this is always the case, the sex that is the prize is the sex that invests most in offspring. In mammals, this is females. In most species, this is females, but that is not always the case. There are some role reversed species where the males do most of the parental care, and you get then a reversal of sex roles. And given the complexity of factors involved in the evolutionary process, it's difficult to predict ahead of time what genotypes will give advantages. Evolution is a backward-looking process. It's always what helped generations in the past survive and reproduce, and it's got really nothing. It's a reflection of these historical processes. It doesn't really have anything to do with what's going on in the contemporary environment, and which is sometimes a misunderstanding about evolutionary theory. And evolutionary processes, it can be modeled mathematically, or they can be simulated. But once again, it's often difficult to know exactly what's going to actually happen in real life evolutionary processes. And population growth and decline can also be modeled mathematically or simulated. Now, given the importance of selection in evolution, resulting genotypes are likely to be adaptive, at least in environments that were typical in the past. And with rapid changes in environments, then genotypes may no longer produce phenotypes that are adaptive in current environments. And the most famous example is the moths of Manchester, they were white on white trees, but then the trees turned black because of the soot pollution of newly industrializing Manchester. And then what was an adaptive trait for the moths being white became maladaptive because then the white moths on the black trees became a target for predators. Now, the evolutionary psychologists have taken this theory from evolutionary biology and applied it to psychology, and they have argued that there's no reason why behavioral and psychological traits are not the result of evolutionary processes. And just like other traits, like physiological traits, they're likely to have been adaptive or be adaptive. They may still be adaptive, but certainly they were likely to have been adaptive in the environments of evolution. And for humans, that environment was the environment of hunter-gatherers for 90% of human history. The people have been hunting and gathering, most of that time was spent in Africa. So evolutionary psychologists have argued that human genotypes for psychological and behavioral traits are likely adapted to this Stone Age environment. And evolutionary psychologists have argued that many of those traits remain adaptive, but not all. And this is a common example, is a taste for sweets, fats, and salts. Over human evolutionary history, sweets, fats, and salts were rare, and they came packaged with important nutrients, vitamins, minerals, a density of calories that were important for human nutrition. So individuals who had traits that encouraged them to consume as many of those items when they're available, with sweets, fats, and salts, were more likely to have fat reserves that were therefore, and they were therefore more likely to make it through epidemics, periods of famine, and scarcity, and so forth. And so the evolutionary psychologists argue that there was selection for a predisposition for liking sweets, fats, and salts, and for consuming as many of those things when they were available. That was adaptive in the past, but it's no longer adaptive in modern populations where we have an abundance of sweet, fatty, and salty food. And the result, certainly in the US, perhaps not in Austria, is an epidemic of obesity, right? So this is a trait that the evolutionary psychologists argue was once adaptive, is now maladaptive. And now this taste for sweets, fats, and salts is part of this evolutionary model of the individual, the model of the evolved actor. So we have all these predispositions to tastes and preferences and behaviors that were adaptive for our ancestors. Evolutionary psychology has come up with a number of other ideal types that they have found useful, including the concepts of a long-term and a short-term mate. A long-term mate is somebody who is seen as a long-term partner and a possible co-parent for raising children, and a short-term mate is not. And evolutionary psychology has gone on to predict that because of the sex difference in fixed biological investment, there's likely a sex difference in human mate preferences that is likely innate. They argue that human females have evolved to be choosier and to choose long-term mates who can help offspring in some way. And over the long periods of time necessary for evolution, human males have primarily been able to contribute to their children by providing resources and social status. And so, given those first two statements, then the deduction is that human females have evolved a genetic predisposition to prefer resource-rich men who are high in social status as long-term mates. And this preference has been found, at least a high preference for financial capability or earning ability, has been found across many, many different cultures. A lot of this research has been done by David Buss and co-authors. And we find it even in the most highly egalitarian societies, such as modern Scandinavia. You still see this sex difference in average mate preferences when asked to rank what they prefer, qualities they prefer in a long-term mate. Women will rate financial capability higher than men do, and men usually place more importance on other characteristics compared to women. Though everybody, another thing that evolutionary psychology has documented is that everybody wants a kind and intelligent mate. So, and a loving. So these are things everybody wants, but there is a sex difference in average preference for earning capabilities. And so this is what the evolutionary psychologists have done, is have predicted a human female preference for high status males as long-term mates. And so this preference in turn predicts a positive relationship between male status and fathering children. And there's lots and lots of evidence of this in pre-industrial societies. And in our book, which is right here, we document the many studies. I'm not sure if I know how to do that pointer here. Oh, yes. And you can see that the measure of male status, it varies. Sometimes it's hunting ability, political status, or prestige, wealth. But all these studies document a positive relationship between male status and number of children. So the higher the status, the more the children, the lower the status, the fewer the children. And strangely enough, there is now an emerging, not strangely enough, obviously, it's what you would predict. But it was still surprising, as Suzanne mentioned, it was surprising to me when I found it in data from the US, and it was surprising for you guys when you found it in Austrian data, but it's now very well attested, and there's more research that comes out every day. But in modern post-industrial societies, these mature, rich societies like Austria, like the US, like all of Western Europe, there is a positive relationship now between male income as a measure of status and children. And we, in the book, we talk about the evidence from the US, the UK, Sweden, the Netherlands, well, actually not the Netherlands, but it is true in the Netherlands, China, Japan, South Korea. And this is despite the fact that at the aggregate level, these societies are not reproducing themselves anymore. That aggregate level fertility is below replacement. So you have the lowest of the low fertility, but at the aggregate level, but at the individual level, you still have a positive relationship between male status and fertility. And a lot of what's driving this is childlessness. low status men, or very low income men, just not having any children at all. And this is just an article that popped up in October. And as I said, you see more and more of this research from rich countries where this relationship, particularly with income and fertility, especially in more recent cohorts, the relationship is switching from a negative relationship to a positive relationship. And Martin Kolk has very good evidence of this from Swedish registry data, how in recent cohorts, the relationship between status and fertility for both men and women, by the way, is now positive in Sweden. And now this is what I found using some recent US data. This is from the Survey of Income and Program Participation. And this has, along the x-axis, you have total monthly income from all sources. So that includes any kind of government benefits, it includes wages, it includes money from trust funds, any kind of income the person gets on a monthly, or business income from businesses, or dividend income. And you can see for men, there's quite a clear positive relationship between total monthly income and number of biological children. For women, it's the opposite. In the US, there's still a major trade-off for women between childbearing and raising and income earning. In societies like Sweden, where that trade-off has largely been ameliorated by very generous parental leave policies and other transfer programs, it's actually now become positive for women as well, the relationship between income and fertility. And a part of the mechanism for these outcomes I have shown, and Feeder and Huber have also shown, is that in the US, high-income men are more likely to be married, they're less likely to be divorced, they're less likely to be childless. If they are divorced, they're more likely to remarry. So there is behavioral evidence that these men are disproportionately selected into and reselected into marriage if the marriage fails. And Feeder and Huber found with the Wisconsin longitudinal survey data, I believe, that income, personal income, not household income, their own income, that a household income, of course, can be contributed by the spouse or partner. Income from personal income for men explains 18% of the variance in the chance of marriage, and marriage explains 74% of the variance in the number of children. Though Martin was telling me today that the percentage of the variance explained by income for men in a more recent study found it even larger, 30% more than 18. I actually forget what percentage variance I found in this study, but it's a very clear effect that income is a major component of marriageability in the US. Now, evolutionary theory predicts a positive relationship between a woman's own status and access to resources in her fertility, but weaker. A lot of the reasons for this weaker relationship is because simply it's harder for women to have more children. So it's not, so the old, even, for instance, certainly, and this happened in pre-industrial societies, men could have, high status men could have hundreds of children, Ishmael the Bloodthirsty being the guy in Guinness Book of World Records. He had 800 children, at least 800 children, according to Guinness Book of World Records. And obviously that's not possible for any single woman. So the variance on reproductive success is predicted to be greater and for men than for women. And this is what's found in industrial societies. You get this big variance, much higher variance on number of children for men than for women. And you also, but you still see in pre-industrial societies, you still see a positive relationship between a woman's own status and her number of children, but it's a much weaker relationship than it is for men for the reasons I just mentioned. And as I also referred to, for women, the positive relationship between personal status and fertility is reemerging in modern societies, and particularly those societies in Western Europe that have really made there less of a trade-off for women between childbearing, child raising, and income earning. And modern Scandinavia is pretty much really made it very, very possible. They have incredibly generous parental leave, for instance, and it makes it very possible for women to maintain high-income jobs and still have a number of children. And that's what's happening. And higher income men are marrying higher income women, and they're the ones that are having children. And the lower income men and lower income women are less likely to have children and have fewer children if they do. So you're seeing this positive relationship between personal status and fertility reemerging in modern societies, even for women. It's very, very clear for men, but it's been clear for men at least since I've been analyzing the data, and the earliest data I analyzed was 1994. And that was a very strong positive relationship between men's personal income and number of biological children. So that has been around for quite some time. It's this reemergence also of the positive relationship between status and fertility for women that's happening in Western Europe, but we're even seeing it in the US. Historically, there's been a negative relationship between education and fertility for women in the US, but even that's starting to change. So in other societies, such as the US, the negative relationship between higher levels of education, income, and fertility for women persists. As I said, though, this is changing. And you might say, well, I thought the relationship between status and fertility is negative. Well, that's the received wisdom. That's certainly what I thought when I first started analyzing the data over 20 years ago. And certainly in most of the 20th century in the US and probably Europe, that was true. There was a negative relationship between status and fertility for men and women. And in fact, we see this in all societies undergoing the demographic transition, which is the change from high birth rate, high death rate society to low birth rate, low death rate societies. And during that process, you see the relationship between status and fertility going from positive to negative. And you see that in all modernizing societies in Asia and even in African countries now that are starting to modernize and seeing the fall in birth rates characteristic of the demographic transition. And what's happening is when you have modernization and industrialization, you get a radical change in the sources of social status. The sources of social status in pre-industrial societies things like land owning. And then when you get to an industrial society, then status is rewarded to people with high levels of education and high occupations that require a great deal of education. So people start spending time and money investing in their own education and that of their children, and at the expense of their fertility. So you get that negative relationship between status and fertility. High status people have fewer children. But once again, this has changed and is in the process of changing in contemporary industrialized, mature industrialized societies. And once again, you see it very clearly for men, but it is also emerging for women. And so these trends in mate preferences, these trends in the relationship between status and fertility, the evolutionary model of the actor can help explain those trends. There are many more that the evolutionary model of the actor can help us explain. The greater involvement of women than men in childcare, the lower probability that mothers abandon their offspring, sex differences in violent crime, sex differences in mental health problems, typical patterns and exchange processes. The model of the evolved actor can help us explain all these social processes. And evolutionary theory can also predict phenomena that other social science theories cannot. Recently, Andrew Cherlin used kin selection theory to predict that individuals would provide more financial assistance to biological nieces and nephews than to cousins. And he used kin selection theory and was very pleased to see him using evolutionary theory. He's a very well-known family sociologist. He predicted that people would give more financial assistance to their biological nieces and nephews because individuals share a larger percentage of their genetic material with their biological nieces and nephews, 25%, as compared to only on average 12.5% for cousins. And no sociological theory predicts this difference in giving to biological nieces and nephews in preference to cousins, because in US society, there are no norms regarding giving to collateral relatives. There are very strong norms about giving to lineal relatives like parents and children, but there are no norms at all about giving to your cousins or nieces or nephews. And but indeed, Cherlin found evidence that modern Americans are more likely to provide financial assistance to their biological nieces and nephews than to their cousins. And I have found evidence in other work that I have done, empirical work using US data on the Travers-Willett prediction that high status individuals will be more likely to have boys among their biological offspring, and high status individuals will be more likely to invest in boys, and then the reverse is true. Low status individuals will be more likely to have girls among their offspring, and also more likely to invest in their female children. And I've found evidence for this using fathers' socioeconomic status. I found high SES fathers have more boys among their offspring, and the sons of high SES fathers receive more education, just in terms of years of education, than the daughters, and the daughters of low status fathers receive more education than the sons, which conforms to the predictions of the Travers-Willett hypothesis. Okay, so here I've talked about why evolutionary theory provides a model of the actor that should be used in social science uh, and may be considered a necessary theory since humans are evolved biological entities. However, we also in this paper argue that the evolutionary model of the individual should be complemented with other modes of explanation. And you have Tim Bergen's 4 modes of explanation in biology. This comes from there. The phylogenetic, which refers to the evolutionary history of the organism, the ontogenetic, the development of an organism, teleological, the ultimate evolutionary goal, and mechanistic, or the causal mechanisms by which an outcome occurs. And the other sciences lack the 2 evolutionary modes, the phylogenetic and the teleological. But since humans are biological, all 4 apply to social science. And so far, I've stressed the teleological mode in developing a theory of the evolved actor, the individual actor. But also necessary and is scientific theory and explanation in the ontogenetic and mechanistic modes, less so the phylogenetic mode, which belongs to biology proper. And in the ontogenetic or developmental mode, scientists need to identify the genes and gene complexes that underlie the identified human characteristics and how they develop in the maturing human. So, for example, there are likely genes or gene complexes that underlie or lead to the predisposition for favoring kin, as predicted by kin selection theory. And my colleagues have, Martin and Suzanne, have done some of this work showing the genetic correlates of various human behaviors, especially behaviors associated with status acquisition, such as education, income earning, and there's lots and lots of other social behaviors and individual characteristics that they have found genetic correlates for. Sometimes single genes, more generally, they've come up with these polygenic scores, which are sort of packages of genes that tend to be correlated with certain social and other outcomes. And the mechanistic mode, the causal mode, generally social sciences have tended to flounder here because you get direct proximate explanations for things like sex differences in mate preferences and sex differences in the relationship between status and fertility, but they have not been fitted into these nested models as science requires of ever more granular explanations at lower levels of analysis. And sometimes social scientists will refer to individual behaviors and individual preferences, but often the reasons they give for why people prefer what they do or behave the way they do is because of some socialization into a culture. And so people prefer certain things and behave in certain ways because of the culture. But then, of course, what is the culture? It's the way people behave and the things they believe and prefer and so forth. So it's a very circular argument often in the social sciences. And so we argue in this paper that social science needs to get out of this rut and connect up with the life sciences, and especially the evolutionary biology of the individual actor for better social science explanations. So in sum, today I have argued, or we have argued, that good social scientific theory should consist of nested theories from micro to macro, and parts of those theories must be deductive or mathematizable, because that's how you build truth, because mathematics is the language of science, and so it's how science becomes cumulative. And theory at higher levels of analysis must be compatible with theory at lower levels of analysis. And we have argued that evolutionary theory is a good theory for social science because it provides the best possible model or ideal type of the individual actor. Parts of this model of the actor are mathematizable. It fits with theory at more micro levels, theory of evolutionary biology, and it can help us predict population trends at macro levels. That being said, we argue that evolutionary theory should be, and evolutionary models, causal models should be supplemented with further work on ontogenetic or developmental processes and proximate causal mechanisms. So thank you very much, and I'll entertain your questions at this point.